Can you guys hear me? So just let me know in the chat, please, when you can hear me to make sure that the sound is working well. Great. Okay, so this is going to be a live stream for the test that we are going to be having tomorrow. The test ended up being about 45 questions, all said and done. The last 4 or 5 are going to be kind of off of a timeline that you're going to be expected to be able to read and answer questions related to Napoleon's life and the French Revolution. So make sure you kind of are able to do that kind of thing. Otherwise, it's pretty much just exclusively multiple choice questions. There's one section for the Enlightenment. It's going to be kind of there are 5 different Enlightenment thinkers we talked about, and they're gonna each one's gonna be A, B, C, D, or E, and then there's gonna be different topics that you're gonna need to kind of match up to the Enlightenment thinker that we are asking. So, for example, if we talked about if the statement says something about natural rights and John Locke will be permanently A, then you will just kind of mark A for natural rights on that particular spot on the Scantron or just on the test. Okay? So there are 45 questions. There are going to be 45 questions on the test all together. So not that large. We thought it was going to be more like 50 something, but it didn't end up being that much. So 45 is the number, for sure. So I figured the best kind of way to use this time would be to kind of run through the study guide. Of course, if you guys wanted to, you are able to watch the review videos that are just on my channel. So let me just show you where those are really quickly, so that way you can kind of see those, right? So here is what the channel looks like. You guys should be able to see it when you get to it, or something similar to this. You're going to just go to the World History 2 playlist, and then you can actually go to the other videos here, right? The one on the Scientific Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Enlightenment. They got a little bit out of order there, but they should be able to help you study if you are explicitly looking for kind of someone talking over the slides. So that's why I made those. I'm sorry I didn't make a Napoleon one. I figured it was the freshest. You all should have just watched a video for homework, and I didn't necessarily need to go completely over that, especially if I'm going to be going over the study guide here momentarily, and you guys did a study guide in class and things like that. So let's kind of get going, I guess. And if you guys have any questions along the way, since no one has asked any yet, then well, we'll get going. So let me just bring it up. I gotta find it. So if you didn't know, right, this is Blackboard, or this is what at least my Blackboard looks like. Go to our class. From our class, you should have access to those YouTube videos as well. And then the guide, the test guide, right, got put into assignments by Mrs. Kipperman. So it's right here, Unit 6 key. Should help you be able to fill out the study guide if you have not finished it yet. And I suggest, if you haven't finished it yet, to kind of get it out right now, and you can kind of fill out things as I run through it here, okay? So let's open it up. So this is what it looks like when you open it up, right? So there are a number of different, these are all the different pages. Mrs. Kipperman was kind enough to fill out this answer key for us. So let's kind of run through it quickly. So we are, for the first part of the test is on the Scientific Revolution. There's no real necessarily, it's going to be relatively in order, but it's not going to necessarily be completely in order. But for the most part, the first topic on the test is going to be on the Scientific Revolution, right? And the Scientific Revolution, as you can see here, it starts in the middle of the 1500s, right? And people kind of begin thinking about that physical world in a bit of a new way, right? And this new way of thinking, especially using things like the scientific method and such, is going to lead to the Scientific Revolution, right? So we had 5 different people that we are in particular asking for you to know, right? And the 5 are Nicholas Copernicus, Johannes Kepler, Galileo Galilei, Isaac Newton, and William Harvey. So let's kind of just run through those relatively quickly, right? So Nicholas Copernicus was the guy that did the heliocentric theory of the universe, right? So that essentially that everything revolves around our sun and not the geocentric, like Ptolemy had said, where everything revolves around the earth, right? And so big difference there in philosophy and ideology there. You're going to have Johannes Kepler, who is going to kind of work off of that mindset a bit, and he's going to determine using mathematics the elliptical orbits of the planets, right? An ellipse is kind of this elongated oval that's kind of on a similar plane, right? So all the planets are orbiting more or less on the exact same plane, and they're doing this kind of these big elliptical orbits, right? And all the orbits are a little bit different shapes too, just based off of the gravitation of the sun and things. Right, so Galileo is the one that uses the telescope to support that heliocentric theory. He proves it essentially using his observations. Sir Isaac Newton establishes the laws of gravity and motion, among other things. He invents different types of calculus to be able to prove his laws of gravitation, right? And remember, the laws of gravitation aren't actually going to be discovered because an apple hit his head, right? It's going to be more along the lines that he was basically tracked a comet and did the mathematics around it to be able to kind of figure out that there's the same comet working around the sun and that gravity exists, right? And then lastly, we had William Harvey. William Harvey is the man who discovers the circulation of blood in the human body. Okay, how's it going? 1, 2, 1, 3, 4, A, B, C, D, E. I have no idea who you are, but anyway, moving on. So the scientific revolution, right, is going to be based off of experimentation and observations, right? It's using those observations and experimentation to draw conclusions based off of evidence, right? That's the whole idea of the scientific method. You're using reasoning and logic to kind of come to conclusions after you testing hypothesis with your observations and all of that good stuff, right? So, other words, the Enlightenment. So that's kind of a brief, quick rundown about the scientific revolution, and you don't really need to know much more than that. No worries, Jack. No problem at all. So you really shouldn't need to know much more than that for the scientific revolution. Let's kind of keep rolling if you guys don't have any more questions on that. So let's kind of move into the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment is other words known as the Age of Reason, and you should definitely know that. I'm going to say for sure study this page right here where I'm circling with my mouse. This is going to be the source of a good amount of questions on the test, right? There could be questions asking who wrote the Leviathan, or what was Thomas Hobbes' major work. It might be phrased that way instead. So things like that. It might then ask what is said in the Leviathan. So really know this page for sure. Let's see if I can zoom in here a little bit to give you guys a little bit better of a view if you're following along, right? So I probably can zoom in a little bit more here. That's probably pretty good, right? Okay, so Thomas Hobbes, let's kind of briefly run into him quick, okay? So Hobbes, he wrote the Leviathan, right? And he is saying that humans exist in this state of nature, or other words, state of war, right? And that life is going to be nasty, brutish, and short as a result, and that ultimately humans need to consent to government for protection from the people that will be acting on their selfish impulses in this constant state of war, okay? So that's Thomas Hobbes in a nutshell. Moving on to John Locke, you have a man who wrote the 2 treatises on government, which is his big work. His big thing is, right, this whole idea of life, liberty, and property, other words, becomes summed up as natural rights, right? And that the purpose of the government is to protect these people's rights, and that ultimately if a government does not protect these rights of the people, that it's actually the people's right to overthrow that government. And this is incredibly important for the Enlightenment thinkers, right? Because that's what we're doing. That's what the United States does effectively, and you have Thomas Jefferson quoting him, exclusively in the Declaration of Independence. You have the French Revolution is going to operate on that mindset too, right? They're not happy with their government, so they're going to get rid of it. They're going to overthrow it, and it gets a little shaky after that, but obviously that's kind of what they're doing. So we have Montesquieu next, right? And he writes this book called On Spirit of Laws, and his idea is that the best government is going to be broken into a couple different branches, right? So you get this separation of powers is the whole idea, right? And that separation of powers is really important. That's what we have adopted in our country today, right? The Constitution, you have the different branches, the executive, the legislative, the judicial, right? All with different powers that check one another. You have these checks and balances as a result, right? It's the foundations of our government and has been for hundreds of years now. So a super important document, and it's going to obviously influence Europe as well. So next you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he is the man that wrote the social contract, right? And that effectively the social contract is a contract between the people and the rulers. I would say yes, Becca. I mean, when it comes down to it, most of the stuff on the study guide is essentially just the PowerPoint notes as well. But there might be a couple things that are on one or not the other. So I would just double check for sure. But you should definitely know both. So the social contract, anyway, right, is that it's the contract between the government and the people, right? That effectively the social contract is what people agree as the general will of the public, right? The general will of the public determines the morality of the group, right? And that if people sometimes do need to give up some rights here in order for the common good, and you're going to kind of get this rule by masses on some level, right? And that ultimately, similarly to Locke, government is based on the consent of the governed, right? Those are really important things. So that's a social contract in a nutshell. If you have any questions on that, just ask in the chat, and I'll try to clarify. So next you have Voltaire, right? And he writes Candide, or Candide, I don't know exactly how to say that honestly. But he is all for religious toleration over religious fanaticism, right? And that leads to effectively his thoughts on that church and state should be separate and separated, right? And that's going to be one of the bases again for part of our government system. It's enshrined in our Constitution, the separation of church and state, right? In the United States. So that's kind of it again for those people. I would again know this like the back of your hand because I can tell you for sure there are probably at least 10 questions that come directly from this right here on the test. So that will be super useful for you to know. Okay, so these political philosophies of these Enlightenment thinkers are going to fuel the revolutions that we talked about, right? And further on, and future revolutions too, that we're going to be talking about moving forward. So we have the Haitian Revolution and things like that we're going to be talking about when we get back from break. But definitely it fuels the United States Revolution, right? The U.S. Revolution against Great Britain, which then that momentum, right? The France looking on and the world looking on, and the success of that is going to fuel the French Revolution for sure. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson, right, used the John Locke's Enlightenment ideas for sure, and the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Bill of Rights, separation of those type of things, are important as well. So I kind of already went over that, so I'm going to kind of skip that. Enlightenment also stimulates religious tolerance, right? We talked about Voltaire there. Good. Okay, so moving on to the French Revolution here quickly, right? So there's not necessarily so much on the actual French Revolution itself. And if you want to know a little bit more, you can listen to my review video that probably goes a little bit more in depth just to kind of give you a little more context in the story, right? But the French Revolution is heavily influenced by those ideas of the Enlightenment we were just saying. It's also heavily influenced by the American Revolution, which again, I was also just saying, right? And the big events that you really need to kind of know about for sure for the French Revolution is the whole storming of the Bastille, right? And what that effectively represents, and kind of a going against the absolute monarchy and the power, in France. That's kind of a big deal. Right? The symbol of the Bastille. The Bastille is the symbol, essentially, of the monarchy and of absolute power and absolutism and all of that good stuff, right? So storming it is a big deal and tearing it down brick by brick, right? So the Bastille had been a prison, right, for those people who had opposed absolutism, and they're going to be in there, right? Although there's actually not that many prisoners when they actually tear it down. But the Bastille's fall is essentially going to represent the beginning of the French Revolution, right? You're going to have lots of different things to come. You're going to have the Women's March. You're going to have not Napoleon. You're going to have Louis XVI being grabbed with Marie Antoinette and brought to Paris. They're going to try to leave, right? And you get that whole deal. And that's kind of going above and beyond what you actually need to know for this test, for sure. But the French Revolution, right, is after this and the beheading of Louis XVI and things like that. You're also going to get the Reign of Terror with a man named Maximilien Robespierre, right, who leads the Committee of Public Safety, right? And that's a big deal. You're going to have thousands and thousands of people, and many of them innocent people, essentially, that are going to be accused of being against the French Republic and against, the Enlightenment ideals and the spirit and the revolutionary spirit, and as a result, they're going to be beheaded by guillotine, right? That's a big deal. In fact, no one is safe, essentially. Robespierre is killed himself, after you get some kind of internal strife, right? So, anyway, after it's all said and done, you're going to end up with Napoleon taking charge, right? And Napoleon, after a number of years of being in charge, he is effectively going to crown himself the emperor as well, which is a really big deal, right? Well, at least it's interesting just thought, right? Because he's going to actually take the crown from the Pope, who was about to put it on his head. He's going to put it on himself, basically saying, I don't need you, in the secular ideas of the revolution. It's kind of a big deal, right? So Napoleon himself is going to go to war with all of Europe, right? He's going to go to war with England and Prussia and Austria and Russia, right? And all of these countries in particular do not like the idea of Napoleon. They don't like the ideas of the revolution because they're absolute monarchs and they don't want this to happen themselves, to them, right? So they're trying to do everything in their power to prevent the spread of these revolutionary and Enlightenment ideas in their own countries, right? And Napoleon wins a ton of battles, as you obviously know. But the last big battle, the last battle site that he's going to lose at, against many of these major powers here, is at the Battle of Waterloo. That's the second time after he'd been exiled the first time. The first time he's exiled at Elba, and then the last time, after the Battle of Waterloo, is going to be exiled at St. Helena. Okay, so some of the lasting impact of Napoleon in general, right, is that you have these 5 major characteristics that we asked you to know, right? The big one, these 5 big ones are that all citizens are equal before the law, right? He's talking about religious toleration. He's pro-business, establishing of public schools. It restricted the freedom of speech in the press, which is kind of counter to what we have here in our country, right? So that's kind of just interesting to think about. So when Napoleon is now defeated after Waterloo, you are going to have this new meeting by these monarchies, essentially, right? By these major powers that participate, right? And it's going to happen in the city of Vienna in Austria. And it's going to be, because of that, known as the Congress of Vienna, right? And you're going to have the 4 big powers that are there: England, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, right, that are participating, and they actually also include France, right, as the non-victorious power, and that's actually kind of a big deal, right? Because think about it, after World War I know we haven't necessarily gotten to that yet, but you probably talked about it at least a little bit. You're not going to include the major losing powers in the negotiations, and that's a big deal, and it's going to set the stage for World War II, not that long later. And here's the cat for anyone who wants to see him. No, there's the cat. Whoa, it's the cat. He's going to stay on my lap for the time being. Hey, stop nipping me. So, anyway, right, you have the Congress of Vienna that establishes a number of different things at this meeting, right? And the big things that are established that they're trying to do is trying to, again, stop these revolutionary ideals, right? They are re-establishing the monarchies that had been thrown away by Napoleon to their thrones, right? And because of that, they're going to actually redraw the political map of Europe, right? Napoleon had taken control of many of these different countries, in different areas, and had included them into France. So now these things need to be redrawn again and re-included in the old kingdoms and things like that. And they also wanted to surround France to prevent any future aggression, right? They didn't want this to happen again from France. So they were aiming to restore a balance of power in Europe, because the hope was that with a balance of power and that no country being much stronger than the other, and all of them being, the similar strength, then that this likely, hopefully, would never happen again with Napoleon, right? So that's kind of an important thought, an important point of the Congress of Vienna. Those things for sure could show up on their test here. And then really to sum it all up, right, you have different thoughts, right? You have conservatism at least in this time, it's going to be different than what we might think of conservatism and liberalism here currently in America, right? Democrats, Republicans. But the ideas itself, conservatism versus liberalism, back then in particular, conservatism was kind of keeping to the old traditions, right? So members of the nobility, right, were in favor of monarchies. They didn't want much change. They liked things the way they were, right? That's conservatism, in a nutshell. And liberalism is looking at the Enlightenment ideals, right? It's many of the people in the middle class and the merchants and the lower classes, right? They're in favor of parliaments. They're in favor of having a representation in their governments, right? They want this change because they see this conservatism and they see the monarchies, right? There's still the issues that led to the French Revolution in restoring the monarchies. So these people are going to continue to push for change going forward. Okay. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. So if you have any questions about anything I just said, please feel free to take the next 30 seconds to a minute or so and put it into the chat. And after that, after a minute goes by and then we get any more questions or not, then I'm gonna probably sign off here and let you guys get back to your studying. So remember again, right, you can go, if you want to, you can watch this video all over again if you want. Maybe you don't watch it tonight, maybe you watch it again tomorrow morning before class, might not be a bad idea, especially if you're in 5th period and you have returns. Definitely wouldn't be a bad idea at all to kind of watch it over again. If you're 1st period, I don't know, watch it on the bus or on the ride home, on the ride to school or something like that. But most of the stuff, if you watch this and know this, know all the stuff on here, then you should do pretty dang well on your test tomorrow. Okay? Since I haven't seen any more questions, we are going to call it a night. So I hope you guys all have a good night, good rest of your night, and good luck with the rest of your studying. Goodbye.